All right, thanking God the Father, the Son, and the Spirit for the way that they can help us understand the Aharit, a word that came from one of the best sermons I ever heard. That means the end. As I think Isaiah will say, God understands the end of a thing from the beginning, and one of the advantages to accepting his counsel is he can help us understand the end of a thing before we even begin it. But even when we don't understand, following the advice or the counsel that he's giving us can help us end up in the right place even when we don't have everything clearly in mind. And with that, Paul in Galatians chapter 5 is helping them to see the churches in Galatia, the aharit, or the end of, trying to once again blend the truth of what God is calling them to do with the old law, the Mosaic law, understanding that it is only one type of blend or syncretism that is endangering the churches, because by the time you get to the church or the letter he writes to the Colossians, he's not going to talk about them being tempted by the old law. He's just going to say, it is in Christ alone that you are going to find what you're looking for, if you are looking for the promises or the fulfillment of the promises that God is giving. And so the old law is just one thing that we can try to blend with Christ that'll simply end us in the wrong aharit, or the wrong end. And so Paul is going to help them see that in Galatians chapter 5, using the law of Moses as the example of what's troubling them in Galatia, in the regions of Galatia. Understanding that in verse 1. Oh yeah, if we haven't titled it yet, I want to title it You Want, because those two words are going to come up literally in verse 17 toward the end of the chapter. But before that, by way of summary, he is going to, in a lot of ways, continuing what he mentioned at the end of chapter 4, in verse 1 of chapter 5, tell them to stand, understanding that Christ has set them free. And in verses 2 through 6, he is going to say, or warn them, or maybe even plead with them, do not be taken by the misconception that, as we mentioned, that you can blend the law of Moses with the law of Christ and come out with a pure devotion to Christ and a full reward of what God has promised to those who are genuinely, completely following his son, being led by his spirit. And so with that, he is going to say, if you try to blend the law of Moses with Christ, Christ is going to be no advantage to you, because if you are doing part of the law, you're obligated, as he's already said, to keep the whole thing. And so likewise, he's going to say the only thing that really matters in verse 6 of that section is faith working through love. Understanding that love is something he's going to mention 3 times, twice at least from a practical perspective, telling us the things that love empowers, that will actually help us understand, as he's going to get to toward the end, the signs that we are actually in a healthy relationship with the Spirit of God, not trying to blend the things that God is calling us to do with things that might be more comfortable. And so he's going to say faith working through love is one of those things that is going to help guide us in the right direction toward the right aharit, the right end. Understanding that 7 through 12 are where he's going to ask, who is guiding you or tempting you to try to make this blend? My ad lib, but going back to the previous 6 verses, that's basically what he is talking about. The blend of, like we said, not to be a dead horse or beat the dead horse, the blend between Christianity and the more comfortable fit with what they left behind in Judaism. He's questioning who is doing it, and whoever it is, he's saying they are going to get the fit penalty for blending or watering down the truth of God. As in verses 13 through 15, he is then going to talk about, yes, you do have freedom, but as he often writes, or seems to have written to both the believers at Rome, the believers at Corinth, and now at Galatia, don't get it twisted. Use your freedom for healthy reasons. Once again, calling on them to understand the prime directive, for lack of a better term, their duty to love. He's going to say, but through love, serve one another. As is then going to help them understand the alternative is, once again, an aharit that they might not understand when they get into the habit of biting at each other. And he's going to say, it's not one of those things that you can easily control, because if you get into the habit of biting and devouring one another, you may find yourselves consumed by one another. The beginning, biting, does not necessarily lead to a clear aharit. So he's helping them understand the end of the divisions, or the fights that start small, for lack of a better term. So with that, in verses 16 through 24, he is going to go on to talk about two different paths, walking by the Spirit in verse 16, something that will keep them from gratifying the desires of the flesh, as he is going to talk about the way that the flesh and the Spirit are really at odds, and we in some ways seem to be caught in the middle. At least our choices are caught in the middle, because our title verse is verse 17, where he's going to say, for the desires of the flesh are against the Spirit, and the desires of the Spirit are against the flesh. For these are opposed to each other, to keep you from doing the things you want to do. Something that we'll circle back to as he will then go on to help us understand that there are red flags for a mindset, or a mindset that we've embraced that's actually indulging or finding itself enslaved to the flesh, as opposed to what we'll call maybe green flags for signs that we are actually in step with a healthy relationship with, or in step with God through a healthy relationship with the Spirit. Understanding that, the relatively famous terms, so I'm not going to take the time to read them, because I want to talk about more or less the impression they left upon me with regard to whether or not we can, today, as we live in whatever is it, 21st century America, or 21st century, whatever part of the world you're in, how we can know whether or not we are really still sensitive to these flags or these indicators or symptoms that Paul has given us for whether or not we are actually in a healthy relationship with God. So I'll circle back to it, but he's going to conclude the chapter in verse 25 by adding another, I guess, compare and contrast between a healthy sign versus a sign that we might be heading in a direction or headed toward the wrong aharit. He's going to say, if you keep in step with the Spirit, you'll be, headed in a healthy direction, as opposed to final warning he's going to give. He's going to say, let us not become conceited, provoking one another and envying one another. And at least three things came to mind. That whole concept of keeping in step with the Spirit reminded me again of that concept of us essentially seeming like we might be caught in the middle of the flesh and the Spirit vying for control over the things that we want to do. That whole concept of keeping in step, that didn't so much ring a bell with me until I thought about it from this perspective. And once again, this is all a paraphrase and illustration from this point on. When I thought of an illustration that I heard from a column mentor who passed on not too long ago, great preacher, who said that Christianity is a constant course-correcting procedure. It's like driving a car. I use the illustration, or I steal his illustration from time to time. If we were driving down the road before the age of self-driving cars, we would consider it odd if we thought that we were going to drive a windy road with our hands off of the steering wheel. Or for those of you who are good at driving with your knees, with nothing touching the steering wheel. And so he said, sometimes we lose touch with the fact that when we see phrases like keep in step, that's Paul's first century language for something that may be more akin to us understanding what it's like to have constant contact with the steering wheel that's keeping us safe on windy and dangerous roads. And when he is saying that there are two paths here, one is leading you to a very dangerous and regrettable aharit, he is saying the way that you avoid that path is to keep in step or steer consistently toward the fruits of the Spirit, which I will go ahead and read now, verse 22. But the fruit of the Spirit is love, as we mentioned before, one of those things that he mentions 3 times in this chapter, leading off the list of healthy things. It's love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. Against such things, he's going to say that there is no law. And so understanding that the things that we want to do are not always aligned with those things, we have that steering metaphor. Every time we have a desire to do something, I think we begin to set a healthier path towards a desirable aharit, one we don't have to regret. We get in the habit of taking our desires and constantly, consciously steering them in the direction of love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, etc., until it becomes intuitive. Because later on, the Hebrew writer is going to talk about the whole concept of maturity being attached to practicing things like these. And it also warned me and reminded me of an illustration I use from time to time that I'll get to. Should I use it? Okay, I got it out of sequence. But illustration that I use from time to time with Bob Dylan in that song that he had, you're going to serve somebody. And so when he says here, Paul says in verse 17, the flesh and the Spirit are at odds, so you don't do the things you want to do. Bob Dylan, even as a pop artist, noticed, as we have noticed here from time to time, It might be the devil or it might be the Lord, but you are going to serve somebody. And a pop artist understands the very same thing that Paul seems to be explaining to the Galatians here. Your desires are in some ways an illusion. Like we said, sometimes the whole concept of free agency is a dangerous illusion in a society where we are encouraged to believe that we are independent, free agents in this life. So with that, it also reminded me of that whole concept of at what point do these things actually lose their effect on us? Is it possible that we can read these lists of do's and do nots and have them basically kind of roll like water off a duck's back, not really getting into our hearts to help us understand that if we're doing some of these things on the verse 19 through 21 list of things that are red flags and we are really headed towards an unhealthy ahari, do we even care anymore? It reminded me of three things. One, I forget his first name. I think it's Harry Markopolis, Michael Berry, and then a gentleman who represents really a large number of folks. I won't say his name, but a large number of folks who used to work at Boeing, illustration I've used before. Harry Markopolis was a gentleman who did the math on a certain set of famous investments before they ended up going bad. And he warned a number of people before those investments went bad that they were quite possibly a Ponzi scheme. The man he warned about was Bernie Madoff, who ended up being one of the most famous Ponzi schemes, at least to this point, or the one who ran one of the most famous Ponzi schemes in American history. And he was not all that different from Mr. Michael Berry, who was one of the feature characters. He's a real life person, though, in The Big Short, a movie that was about the warnings that were sent out by various short traders who trade or bet on certain outcomes in the stock market, who warned that the housing bubble, among other things, was going to lead to eventually the 2008 housing crisis. And then there were those who worked at Boeing, and we can't say because I don't think it's been litigated, whether or not their warnings as whistleblowers were considered causal in relationship to potentially avoiding some of the recent big, major airline crashes that Boeing has experienced with its planes. But they all reminded me of one simple thing, and that's a saying that goes, you can defeat 40 wise men with a single fact, but you will not be able to do much with, good night. But 40 facts may have no effect on a single unwise person. And that is what reminded me of what Paul is trying to persuade the Galatians of in verses 16 through 24, when he is giving them red flags for signs that they are headed toward an aharit that's very regrettable versus signs that they are walking in a way or in a healthy relationship with the Spirit. None of it matters if they have grown immune to the facts. Understanding that when he says the flesh and the spirit are at odds, so that you do not do the things that you want to do. Ultimately, it reminded me that by way of illustration, it's almost like having a really important meeting. I've used the Minneapolis-Chicago distinction before or recently. It's like having a really important meeting coming up in Minneapolis and hitting the road, not necessarily asking Siri to guide you or checking the map and saying, I remember how to get there, been there 1,000 times. Having a great ride. Along the way, you got all your best food, stop at some of your favorite restaurants, tunes, playlist seems to be just hitting. Great time with your friends. Only realize when you get to your destination, it'd be kind of hard to do this without, seeing some signs that you're heading the wrong way, but indulge me. Either way, by the time you get to your destination, you end up in Chicago, realizing that your meeting was in Minneapolis and you do not have time to fix that error. You might have had a great time getting to Chicago, but if your meeting was important enough, you might have missed out on some important things heading to the wrong destination. And that's what self-interest seems like it represents here in this chapter that I wanted to entitle You Want, because our desires seem to be a more enjoyable way of simply getting to the wrong ahari, the wrong destination. And so, like Bob Dylan said, it might be the devil or it might be the Lord, but we're going to have to serve somebody. And the longer we resist the fact that we're going to have to serve someone because there are powers more powerful than us at work on our choices, sometimes simply indulging our choices is simply a happier way of getting to the wrong aharit, which is why we often say God's best to you as you go forward with him.